Okay, great. We're going to get started, everyone. Welcome. Good. Really delighted to welcome Elisa here, Mekler from IT University of Copenhagen. But before we get started, I just want to say, so after the seminar, we're going to celebrate Elahi, who's recently completed his PhD. So congratulations, Elahi. So it's going to be, if you're sharp upstairs, you might get, a limited supply of the bubbles, but, come and celebrate after the seminar. And on that happy occasion, looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much on the Pretence of Theory in human-computer interaction. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Just a slightly pretentious title, but yeah, thank you so much for having me here at UCLIC. So yeah, on my talk on the Pretence of Theory in HCI, which is kind of like the underlying topic for my ERC starting around the project is called Theorycraft. Yeah. And this is, I mean, it's a bit gloomy in here, and this is a kind of grumpy talk. It's also a bit of a morose talk. So just a brief content warning. There'll be some brief mentions of death and grief. So if that bums you out, maybe it's really brief, but maybe then it's not the talk for you. I like to talk about the people I do the research with, because research is a collaborative endeavor. But yeah, unfortunately, this is a bit of a tragic story, to put it mildly. Yeah, and I guess content warning for total whiplash, because now we talk about theory in HCI, which is tragic, not nearly as tragic, but a bit tragic too in different ways. But first thing first, so what is theory? And I quite like this kind of oldie but goldie of a definition by Sutherland, that theory is an ordered set of assertions about some sort of behavior or phenomenon. It's assumed to hold true. So it's not necessarily true, but we assume it is so. And it is kind of assumed to hold true for, not just one case, but a whole bunch of cases. So it kind of implies some sort of more or less generalizability. And of course, theory is also a bit of an evergreen topic in HCI. I would assume, I would hope that everyone here is at least in passing familiar with Professor Ivan Rogers' work on theory in HCI, and I'm very thrilled to have you here in the audience today. But really, if we look at the history of HCI, like back at 1989 already, we've had Carroll and Kellogg talk about the theory artifact nexus. Of course, there are way more examples, but strong concepts kind of about, okay, how do we develop intermediary or intermediate level theories, or more recently, for instance, also published at Tokai, how do we develop generative theories of interaction that kind of connect, again, kind of broader theories with design. So, long story short, questions of theory have occupied HCI for a long time, to mixed effect. And there have been quite a few lamentations that there probably should be more theory in HCI, and specifically that theory, among other things, is kind of what makes a discipline kind of, an established discipline has theory, develops theories, that theory could serve or theories could serve as motor themes to kind of give some cohesive glue to HCI. Yeah, so the general idea, like, yeah, more theory, that would be a good thing, that would help the maturation of HCI. And now I don't know the details of the exact talk, but I know Casper Hornbeck, who is in the theory, yeah, he's also in the theory game, but he's in the university kind of just on the other side of town, Copenhagen. So I'm not quite sure what he talked about when he was here a few weeks ago, but I'm fairly familiar with his Nordica keynote 2 years ago. on implications for theory. And there he also kind of made an argument that there's a bit of a theory crisis going on in HCI, that in HCI we engage too little with theory, and also kind of why do we not engage more with theory. I'll summarize some of his key points. Like, let me preface that with I on the whole agree with many of his observations. However, in my opinion, I think he's a bit overly focused on these points, and kind of for that sees the forest for all the trees, not anymore. And I think that kind of gets in the way of asking more interesting questions. So, you know, so I don't know if he mentioned that paper when he was here earlier this year, but in a paper he called it with Antti Oulasvirta, they discuss, okay, they analyze a bunch of best papers at CHI 2017 and analyze them in terms of do they use theory for connecting into design, and the finding is mostly no. And then they kind of speculate, I would say, they don't call it that in the paper, about, well, why does HCI not engage more with theory? So they argue in this paper, based on this analysis, that theory use in HCI is inhibited by, for instance, iterative design, that iterative design gets in the way of theorizing. People don't theorize because we can always iterate on our designs. That there is a bit of a resistance in HCI about like not seeing much use and credibility in theory, or also particularly scientific theories. That especially in his keynote 2 years ago, Caspar was arguing that theory is something that is more used for positioning yourself rather than something that is used to inform the research or to inform design. Curiously, kind of like that this is a reason why we don't use more theory in HCI. Another reason they list is that there's in HCI we focus too little on the outcomes of design, or also like in studies, like what's the outcome. Now I would say the last one I don't really consider a reason or a convincing reason for why we don't engage more with theory. Like if anything, there's more a symptom for me. This is kind of something that has bothered me about a bunch of arguments that Caspar and also others have made. A while back, I found this paper from the management sciences. It's called, and it introduced this notion of pretense of knowledge by Sumantra Ghoshal. And it's a really interesting paper. There he argues that well, in management sciences, there are lots of, like, theorizing has been a very popular thing to do, and having theoretical contributions, but that the field has been so focused on creating these theoretical knowledge contributions, and usually also kind of from a more positivist or scientific perspective. Again, like my background is in psychology, so I'm kind of somewhat sympathetic to that angle, but that they're kind of in extreme. It has become kind of all about making nice sounding theories, but that get in the way of management practice, and that even could lead to harmful management practices. Yeah, so yeah, and he terms this kind of, in short, the pretense of knowledge, and though it doesn't like quite transfer to HCI, I found I think some of like broadly some of these ideas or assumptions, I think, are echoed in like work on theory by Caspar, Hornbeck, and others. And now what kind of, you know, what do I kind of mean by the pretense of theory in HCI? Broadly, it's kind of this assumption that, oh, okay, if only we would do more theory, we had more theory in HCI, that would make things better somehow. that oh, okay, having more theory would help fill in the big hole, would lead to give us motor themes, would help accelerate knowledge accumulation, would help inform and lead to replication studies. Usually it's never quite clear like to what, like again, I'm broadly sympathetic to these ideas, but it's never clear like to what end do we want to do that? Just like we should do it more. And so my guess is kind of, this is not so much about what do we want to use theory for, but this is kind of in itself kind of positioning or posturing about just it goes back, and these discussions have been had before. I'm not the first one to bring that up, but this is more about disciplinary legitimacy of HCI and what should HCI look like, and if only HCI were more like a natural science and whatnot. But in essence, and this is the part that bothers me, I find that these perspectives don't really tell us much about how theory is used or could be used, or why it is used in limited ways. And this is why I think it kind of gets in the way of meaningful discussions about how do we want to work with theory, how do we want to develop theory, build theory, use theory in HCI. Yeah. And so here I kind of want to segue to some of my own work, kind of as a case study on self-determination theory as it's been applied to games research in HCI, and just kind of how many people here have heard of self-determination theory? Okay, good, most people. I'll give just a very, very brief rundown. It's a fairly prominent theory of human motivation in psychology. It's been around for over 50 years now in one form or another. It's been applied to all kinds of contexts, to learning at the workplace, for clinical applications, to understand like relationships. It's been quite popular also in the sports domain. And it features a bunch of like theoretical propositions and concepts. For instance, you might have heard of need satisfaction or like the innate psychological needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So that's kind of self-determination theory that again didn't invent these terms, but kind of like popularized these concepts. And strictly speaking, self-determination theory, or SDT for short, is not just one singular theory, but actually consists of 6 mini-theories. And I won't actually introduce any of these, but just kind of like keep that in mind. It's actually a whole bunch of theories and a whole bunch of theoretical propositions that are there to work with. And more interesting also in some ways is that the original developers of self-determination theory, Richard Ryan, Edward Deci, also kind of in some of their overview articles kind of discuss or disclose some of the core assumptions behind the theory. So that it's a broad scientific theory that helps generate questions and assumptions about all kinds of phenomena. It's evidence grounded. That's something that they always emphasize, that it's based on empirical evidence. It is refined through empirical studies, and I quite like that part. That it's SDT scholarship demands of itself clinical, qualitative, and conceptual critique, and also this emphasis on the epistemological coherence and rigor. And we will revisit these statements down the line. But importantly, like SDT also has seen a growing presence in HCI. It's been outside of games. It's been applied to behavior change technologies, as a kind of basis for understanding the user experience, for the design of conversational agents. And it just keeps popping up for all kinds of applications. And even just kind of like a brief glimpse at the ACM Digital Library. So that's now, I didn't check just HCI publications, so also in like computing education and in human-robot interaction, we see more and more mentions of this theory. And then I was just still, I was impressed that okay, on the whole, like we've got over 900 mentions specifically of SDT, and last year like an all-time peak. So on the whole, SDT is on the rise in HCI. And it's been also on the rise in games research, and that, you know, is in some way not surprising, because SDT scholars themselves have applied the theory also to understanding games. And in a nutshell, some of the key findings or key tenets as it relates to games is that, okay, good play experience is about the satisfaction of these psychological needs. And based on that, the authors kind of coined this, they call it a model, a theoretical model, a play experience needs satisfaction. Again, the idea is, okay, satisfying the needs for competence, autonomy, relatedness leads to a positive play experience, is associated with higher player well-being, and so on. And there's also a questionnaire of the same name to kind of assess these dimensions. And so why do we need theory? According to SDT scholars, specifically in the context of games. So in one of their books, they say, well, the absence of good theory would just lead to pure speculation and just seeing causal relationships where there might not be any. Interestingly, kind of looking into their writings, we can also find some suggestions about what, in their opinion, would be ideal ways of leveraging theory, or specifically leveraging SDT, that it's about generating hypotheses, testing hypotheses about how does gaming relate to, say, the play experience or player well-being. And it's quite strongly formulated, like especially this second quote, research that is not empirically testing specific hypotheses doesn't do much to advance our knowledge. So they're very opinionated, like it's a pretty strong. Again, we will revisit that down the line, and we will be grumpy about it. But yeah, so this SDT game, like SDT is widely cited in itself, but games research by SDT scholars is also like has received many citations, and kind of, you know, so we found that quite interesting. And a few years back, my postdoc April Tayak and me, we did this at a paper at CHI where we reviewed uses of SDT in the HCI games literature, or specifically at CHI and at CHI Play. And in short, we found fairly shallow engagement with the theory. Like the theory is often name dropped. It's maybe used to kind of motivate the work, but it's not like, it doesn't inform any research questions, or it isn't used to inform design. And also and papers usually, they either talk about need satisfaction or intrinsic motivation, but all other concepts and all this plethora of mini theories, they're largely absent. Yeah. And another thing, and we found that quite interesting, that okay, the theory is brought up often, but it isn't really used in the ways of at least as in psychology, we like to think of theory as using something to derive hypotheses or to explain phenomena. Based on Yvonne's work, we surmise that, okay, at CHI and at CHI Play, when it comes to games research, at the very least, it seems we use SDT less as a theory, more as a paradigm, kind of as this broad way of looking at games that we've kind of come to agree on in the games community, that kind of shapes how we look at games, the sort of questions we ask, how we evaluate games, yeah, and how we analyze results. But so after the paper was published, we just kind of, like, first of all, we were surprised that the paper seemed to resonate with quite a few people, which it's like I mean, that's always nice, but here it wasn't necessarily planned. It was just kind of a pet peeve of ours where we felt like, oh, people, like, what do they actually say about SDT? But you know, a pet peeve I have about our own paper, like, so we critique our peers about not doing much with the theory, and we kind of like decry the lack of engagement with the theory. But why? Why is that so? And that kind of was a question that kind of lingered and bothered me. And so I talked April into like, hey, we should do a follow-up. And so we started doing that. We were kind of interested in, okay, why are we using SDT in HCI games research more like a paradigm and less kind of as a theory in a conventional way? And so why do we use it in a kind of, do we tend to use it in a more shallow way? And actually, so it's the work on this question that then kind of inspired my ERC proposal. And so that kind of then turned into the spin-off. I'm now going to write a grant proposal. And so just kind of as for the PhD students in the audience, I like to sometimes ask the question, like, what is your pet peeve in the literature or in your research area? And not only is it because I like to rant about pet peeves in research and in academia, but sometimes it can give you like a nice idea for a paper or even a funding proposal. And yeah, but yeah, so we started work on that paper, and we got very far with it, and I'll say more about the paper in a bit. Yeah, but here's the shitty part. So, well, I ended up getting the ERC. That was nice. But a few weeks after I got the news that I got the grant, my postdoc, April Teig, who had moved all the way from Brisbane, Australia to Finland to work with me, passed away from illness. Yeah, so it's I worked very closely with her on this work and on the developing the project idea, and even now, like over 2 years later, it's been a like incredible personal blow. It's more callously also it's been a incredible like professional setback. I just want to emphasize that as well. Yeah, I mourn the loss of a brilliant colleague and a kind of intellectual foil, because April was kind of someone who would always like, you know, challenge me. But yeah, so it took me a while kind of until I could stand looking at this paper that was almost ready for submission. Yeah, well, you know, nothing improves kind of the tragedy of that, but it is of some comfort that now early last month I finally got the acceptance notification for the paper we have been working on. It'll be out in Tokai. I'll be presenting it next year in Japan. I'm also very happy, like I could preserve a lot, like most of April's original writing. So it's really like she did the brunt of the work. Yeah, in that work, that's exactly, we were interested, like, okay, why do we tend to use SDT kind of as a paradigm? And why do we tend to use it kind of in a shallow way? Like obviously, like using it in a theory in a paradigmatic way doesn't necessarily imply shallow. In this case, it kind of does. But also the big question, why is SDT nevertheless popular in games research? And maybe this could tell us something about how to foster theory uptake in HCI. So yeah. So in some ways, this work was follow-up, but also an extension of the Kai paper from a few years back. So we're interested, okay, how do HCI games researchers use the theory. And just briefly, so again, we looked at Chi and Chi Play. We also looked at a bunch of other venues like the Foundations of Digital Games, IGHCS, Tokai, and Computers and Human Behavior. We can kind of debate, okay, is that an HCI venue or not? But there's quite a few HCI authors do also publish there, and there's a kind of lot of psychology flavored research there. And what you can kind of nicely see on the whole, like citations of SDT in the HCI games lit are on the rise. So there's been a bit of a dip in 2020. That's probably because of the pandemic and people couldn't do empirical studies anymore. But on the whole, it's been kind of on the rise again. Yeah. And briefly, okay, so what do we find in terms of how the theory has been applied? So it's been a fairly similar pattern to our previous paper. So the theory is often mentioned in the related work section, or it's been kind of name dropped in the discussion section. SDT-based questionnaires for measuring need satisfaction or motivation are kind of popular as a kind of measure of the games user experience. But unlike kind of what the SDT scholars call for, we found relatively few applications of the theory for hypothesis testing, but also like few applications for using the theory for design, which is interesting because sometimes the theory is used kind of post hoc to say like, oh, this is why our design is successful or nice or good in some way. And importantly, like over half of the papers we reviewed, like they wouldn't really, like the contribution wouldn't change, the form of the research wouldn't really change if SDT were not mentioned. Now, one of the more interesting findings, so this time around, we also coded papers, like how many papers like explicitly compare their findings or other theoretical frameworks to SDT, like, so do they contrast them, and how many actually critique the theory? Very few papers. And just to give you an example kind of for this reluctance to critique the theory, and importantly, there were a fair bunch of papers where the findings of the project, of the study, actually diverged from what SDT would postulate, and yet there seemed to be quite a bit of reluctance to critique or even just contrast these divergent findings with the original theory. And kind of one of the most egregious examples, I believe that was from a paper that was published in CHB. Like the authors say, like they actually do not want to get into the debate at all. But okay, how does it relate to the theory and to the controversy around how the rewards affect motivation? And yeah, we were kind of baffled by this reluctance to not just engage further with the theory, but even just kind of to say like, ooh, our findings are not like that. Why is that so? So why do we kind of tend to use the theory in such a limited way in HCI games research? Well, one kind of, the first explanation that comes to mind, because that's kind of emblematic to a lot of HCI research, also when it, like other areas of HCI, other theories, not just SDT. There've been like similar works on the trajectories framework or on the reality-based interaction framework. HCI has a bit of a history of not engaging that much with theory. And again, I assume that is fairly congruent with what Casper mentioned a few weeks ago. And beyond theory, there's also a bit of a history in HCI to kind of not engage too much with the work that we cite, and that's of course has a bunch of problems that comes with that. But there's when it comes to SDT, at least we believe there's more than just kind of this lack of engagement. And here I want to revisit kind of some of these core assumptions. Okay, SDT has this scientific theory, evidence-grounded, epistemological coherence and rigor. So that all sounds like very nice, very solid. Now, if we look at SDT game scholarship, as we do in that paper, No, yeah, again, and also this emphasis on hypothesis testing, and you know, good theory avoids pure speculation. Now, if we look at scholarship on games by SCT scholars, it's a little it's a little wild. You know, that's from their book. And you know, I just want to juxtapose that with like, SCT is an evidence-grounded framework. And there's this graph about, okay, why does Halo, like as one of the most commercially successful games, like why did it succeed? And they're like, oh, it's because it's been better at satisfying psychological needs. This finding has never been published in a peer-reviewed format, or even like you can't find the study also in a white paper. It's just, it doesn't exist. That's the only thing we know about this study is this graph in the book. You know, I can get nitpicky. It's like, what do the axes mean? The Penn's questionnaire, which what this probably refers to is on a 7-point Likert scale, and this graph goes way beyond 7 points. So who knows? And again, like in terms of epistemological coherence and rigor, then there are just some absolutely outlandish statements about how games and different concepts from SCT relate. So this quote there's a bunch of writings where they connect self-determination theory to the notion of the hero's journey and how that explains why games are popular. Or what makes for a good player experience. So and this notion that, okay, this helps quantify the value of here, this they call it the learner hero construct as a touchstone to optimizing self-determination. And I've reread that part over and over and over again, and I don't know what it means. There's no empirical work to back that up. It's to me, this is another example of the pretense of knowledge. It's scientific sounding gibberish. Yeah. So, you know, and in the paper we go in more details, like, but in short, there are many claims made by SCT scholars about games that have never been empirically backed up, or at least they've never been published. They never really mention any of those mini theories that they like to exhort otherwise. Many of the theoretical propositions are either inconsistent. Again, I won't go into detail here, but in the paper, there's a lot of that. The preprint is now available online if anyone's interested in getting into the nitty-gritty. Many of the theoretical propositions are also kind of underspecified. And, you know, epistemological coherence and rigor, not so much. Yeah. So, you know, returning to this initial question, so why do HCI games researchers use SCT in limited ways? Of course, we have a history of limited engagement. That's not so much yet maybe part of our research praxis. But also it's kind of telling that games research by SCT scholars shares quite a few similarities of features with games research, or many of the same flaws as HCI games research. And you know, and put differently, well, if you know, looking to the original sources doesn't really provide us with good examples for how to use the theory, it's that of course makes it more difficult for HCI games research to figure out how do I productively leverage the theory. But kind of what exacerbates this is this reluctance to critique or to contrast findings. So SCT is rarely questioned in the HCI games literature. Like, you know, if SCT games or SCT scholars in their games research would make all kinds of wild claims, in HCI we'd be like calling them out and, you know, building on that work, or, you know, avoiding these claims. That'd be something else, but we don't. We seem to be reluctant to react or even challenge and question those. So, you know, to return to this notion of SCTs being used as a paradigm, it's been used as an unquestioned paradigm, and this is, I think, where the real problem comes in. And it's kind of this self-perpetuating thing where we keep citing the theory, like I've been now active as an AC and SC in the HCI games community. Like reviewers often invoke SDT, or they critique other papers for not having mentioned SDT for sometimes no good reason at all. So it's kind of really become this whole self-perpetuating thing, and it really gets in the way of doing better research. Now, related to that, okay, how did SDT become so big in our community? And to that end, we as part of this bigger investigation, we also analyzed how the theory has been talked about at the Game Developers Conference, which is one of the largest industry conferences around games. And interestingly, like there's a bunch of talks and where industry professionals talk about SDT kind of, and the assumption seems to be, oh, we're all game developers, all of us have heard of self-determination theory. And also, if you look in game design or game development textbooks, the theory is often kind of mentioned there. So it's interesting that it already has this big presence at industry venues. And there's been this nice short paper from 2 years ago by Suzanne Poller, now at Utrecht, and Cody Phillips, now back at QUT in Brisbane, that SDT is kind of, at least in games research in HCI, is unrivaled in its popularity, and it seems to be considered the default option. But again, like, why? How did that come about? And one simple explanation is, well, SDT scholars have presented the theory at industry venues, at industry conferences, and it's been kind of marketed in terms of, oh, it's this practical tool, but it's also science. And important to note, like Scott Rigby, so one of the SDT scholars who's been driving the applications of SDT to games, has his own UX and market research consultancy. So, of course, their commercial interests here. And, on the whole, I think it's nice to see kind of theory and practice connect. But like we discuss in the paper, like sometimes it can kind of color entire fields. So it's something to be mindful. And I just like this slide from one of Rigby's industry talks. And again, the talk is mainly based on SDT, but where they say, oh, we're going to use SDT to science it up and help you sell your game and dominate the market, and with a reference to Breaking Bad, which is kind of wild. But yeah, so, long story short, how did SDT seem to become the default theory in the HCI games research? Well, it's the theory of how it's been introduced to game developers at industry venues leans into existing concerns by industry professionals. So, you want to make your game commercially successful, we've got the formula for it. And the Pence model, like the examples they bring up, they always lean into mainstream game design tropes and success stories. And this is something from a kind of a notion I've been taken from Yvonne's work. Like another reason I think why especially these notions of competence, autonomy, and relatedness, and also intrinsic motivation have become so prevalent is the kind of intuitive concepts. They're fairly easy to explain and latch onto. They're also very malleable concepts. Like you can use them to explain like small game design features. You can also talk about, oh, okay, how do I motivate my team? It's like the granularity is very flexible. But yeah, it's I mean, this is also why it's sometimes not very specific. And that part is very important for games research in HCI. The questionnaire, like the fact that there are questionnaires to measure need satisfaction in games, to like intrinsic motivation is often used kind of as a proxy for enjoyment or engagement in games. And for many years, there were like few validated alternatives in the field. So many researchers kind of flocked to the PENS questionnaire. And what is notable, instead of just citing the questionnaire, it would always be like embedded within like, oh, the questionnaire is based on self-determination theory, which is a major motivational theory in psychology, yada, yada, yada. And it's kind of interesting because, so at CHI, the first use of the PENS is in 2013. And then it kind of goes up from there. So even though we can't like provide like a causal connection, I think it's fairly plausible that the provision of these questionnaires kind of facilitated the uptake of SCT in the research area. And then again, it's the self-perpetuating thing. It's become this thing that is often cited. So other games researchers feel maybe I should also cite it in my own work. Yeah. So in short, SCT seems in HCI games research seems to be popular for rhetorical reasons, like, oh, this is how I motivate my work. I want to kind of broadly ground it in this very well-known influential theoretical framework. It's been a reference for methodological purposes because of the availability of questionnaires. But that in itself, again, I feel that that's more the pretense of theory, kind of like, oh, I want a veneer of theory on my work, even though I don't really use the theory to inform my research questions or my analysis. So it's a bit this theoretical posturing, maybe also that Casper sometimes mentions. But I think all these reasons taken together, I think they help explain, or they at least to me provide a plausible account for why is SDT applied the way it is, or in these kind of more superficial ways in HCI games research. Why is it being talked about, or why is it really questioned? So it's not just, I mean, it's in big parts also this limited engagement with the theory, but there are also all these other factors that shape how we talk and use the theory in HCI games research. And yeah, so I think, and here I think that's where we can break the cycle. Like if we continue to neglect to engaging with the theory, then that just kind of keeps repeating until some other theoretical fads kind of grabs on. And I think perfunctory uses in the long run, like we don't learn much by citing the theory or using the theory in these perfunctory ways. Worst case, and what I've witnessed as a reviewer and as an author, it's like the prominence of SCT has been kind of weaponized against authors who use other theoretical frameworks, like, oh, why did you not use SCT instead? It's more popular. And then they cite our Chi paper, which is quite awkward. Yeah, so we need to engage more purposefully. And yes, and if we do that, then the theory, I think, can be useful to advance research, to advance knowledge development in HCI games. And so I want to briefly kind of continue here on a few ideas for moving towards more intentional theory use. In the paper, we discuss many examples for specifically SDT as it relates to games, but also more broadly, like, okay, what about other theories or HCI more at large? And of course, it's a bit difficult to make very actionable suggestions, but just briefly, I want to return to this definition of theory I brought up. So, okay, this ordered set of assertions. And this is, I mean, there are many like definitions of theory that are kind of similar to that, kind of by, connections between constructs and whatnot. But I actually vastly prefer, so this is a definition that has been provided by Marcin Mielkowski, kind of as a new approach to studying theories. And this notion is not new in itself, but I just quite like how he cites Donald Norman in saying, okay, theory is should be thought of as a sort of cognitive artifact that is used to maintain and display or operate upon information, and it serves a representational function, and it affects human cognitive performance. And I guess that's a very like a fancy cognitivistic way of saying, well, theory, you know, can be used as a tool. I particularly like this description by John Beck and Eric Stolderman on well, you know, what is theory good for? And Yvonne, again, I think your work is one of the few examples that has engaged with, okay, what are the purposes of theory and what can we use theory for? And you know, here, well, theory helps structure knowledge, evaluate it, share it, and so on. So in many ways, I think we need to pivot from thinking of theory as this knowledge contribution in itself, which I think just leads to this, perpetuates this pretense of theory where I don't find it very like useful, and so we need to think more about what do we want to do with theory, and leverage it more purposefully. And again, here Beck and Stolderman kind of describe different models of how we might use theory for shaping research questions as an analytical tool. But why I particularly like, they introduce this notion of theoretical talkback. So not just that we apply theory, but that we have our own findings, our own approaches, like that we discuss, has the theory been useful? Where were there points of divergence? And this is a very simple thing that, at least in HCI games, few papers seem to do. And just to give you, and you know, to give one more shout out to April's work, like one of the examples that I find quite compelling, and you see there's no sorcery here. It's just in the discussion section pointing out, some of our findings don't really line up with what the theory postulated. The theory here itself is not very clear about why is that so. And then, you know, they elaborate, like that opens up the following like research questions, or maybe this is what we should, how we should extend or reconsider the theory, or maybe we should look to other theories instead. Talking back to theory. It's an easy thing everyone can do. I just wish we would do more of that. And to close, in general, just focus more on practices of theory. I think we have a tendency, and again, maybe this is the pretense of theory, where we treat like theory and practice as kind of almost opposites, when engaging with theory is in some ways about practice itself. And that opens up a whole different way of thinking about theory and theoretical engagement. Like, okay, what are the conditions that shape how we use theory? How does theory use differ between, say, game developers and games researchers, or academic games researchers? And of course, I mean, these are broad generalizations, so we could open up that further. How do we adapt or develop theory for different communities of practice? For instance, from basic to applied research, but of course, between academic research and industry practice. And, you know, also, how do we know if the theory is any good? Yeah. So, you know, just kind of what were the main points of the talk? I think there's a bit of this pretense of theory thing going on in HCI, where we are preoccupied with disciplinary legitimacy, not really with the question, what do we want to use theory for, or how do we use theory? And that, I think, draws away attention from the conditions and existing practices that shape how theory is currently used. Instead, we should kind of pivot our attention more, on these conditions that shape how we currently use theory, but also like to think about, well, what do we want to use theory for, or what are different uses for theory? And again, different theories might have different uses. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Time for. Ooh.
Thank you for a great talk. It really was. I think for me to hear this, you know, someone who spends a lot of time thinking critically about theory and why and what's happened with this particular theory, but also thank you for sharing your experience with April. I mean, it resonates with my own personal experience as well. But my question, because I could just go on saying wonderful things about what you've written about, is that you ask, could researchers engage more deeply with this theory? And I wonder whether people, why they don't, it's quite a big theory. And many years ago, when I was having a go at activity theory, because I felt a lot of people used it very superficially, I think, you would have to spend a lot of time reading the original. And I wonder whether people just are too busy, they don't have the time, they just want to take the nuggets, and that's enough to do the legitimacy aspect. So I wondered whether you think, why is it that people don't engage with the theory more?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've also a few years back tried to dabble in activity theory, and I was astonished as how much commitment that I couldn't kind of bring up at that time. I think one of the reasons why we don't already see deeper engagement with, say, SET is because well, there are all these mini theories, all these concepts, and learning about these and how they relate to each other is a bit of a commitment. But I also think like one of the big reasons, and we discussed that a little in the paper, is at least in HCI game scholarship, it's a bit different if we, for instance, look at UX research. We've mainly just looked at existing games papers by SET scholars. And these papers don't mention other mini theories. They just mention need satisfaction and intrinsic motivation. So that's what we stuck with. So I think one of the ways forward, and I'm not saying everyone in HCI should do that, but I think that's, well, whereas I see some of my upcoming work that I have planned as part of the project, and I hope, of course, to see also, and other people have been doing it for other theories, kind of see more translational work. That is like taking maybe one of the mini theories from SET and kind of translate and transform that for a particular technology or for a certain design activity. And I think like kind of translating and preparing new theoretical nuggets, but that do serve like more deliberate, intentional purposes for our community. I think that would be a nice way forward.
Hi, Elisa. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm going to try and formulate my thoughts a little bit. So I also have a background in psychology, and I was thinking a little bit about how I thought about theory as a psychology student versus how I am now as a HCI student. One thing I thought was maybe missing from your slide on like what theory is good for is like, I think the impression I had of the purpose of theory and why in psychology we're trying to construct theory, for example, is that we're trying to aim for some probably unachievable goal of trying to find something that generalizes across all people and like offers like prediction, right? And so I'm wondering, so because of that, there's a sort of assumption that like maybe to a certain level, so if you've got like empirical evidence of about 50 plus years of research backing it up, is there like some level where maybe from a designer's perspective, a computer scientist perspective, you might assume that like there's a lot of evidence, I'm focused on trying to produce a specific outcome, like we give them a little bit of leeway for kind of going, I'm just going to apply it rather than making a kind of theoretical sort of contribution in that area.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Definitely. I think the fact that SET has been around for such a long time, that it's been applied to all kinds of contexts, has really contributed why it's been kind of like to its appeal to HCI and to games researchers. And in the industry talks that we analyzed, like there's also like some quotes that kind of echo that sentiment. Now, what is interesting, I didn't mention that here now, but there's been some very recent work, for instance, by Sebastian Terding and colleagues like from over at Imperial College, that tests some of these claims in the in games research by SET scholars, and found these claims to actually not hold up. So there seems to be a bit of a middle ground here.
Okay, so I'm mindful of the time, but I want to also let people who have questions. So if you do need to jump out, otherwise we'll carry on. I think the conversation's very good. Is that okay? So Frank, and then on to you, Alicia.
Thank you for a great talk. This is really important work. My question is, how has this analysis changed the way you engage with theory? Have you, has it changed your practice? And there are sort of insights there in terms of your own work that perhaps others might be able to draw upon?
Well, first of all, I've become a little embarrassed about some of my earlier works, like SET, for instance, figured prominently in my PhD research, and where I looked at that, did some empirical studies on this gamification effect motivation. We actually bring up one of these examples kind of as a critique point for okay, where I had results that did not match up with SDT, but then the discussion section is a whole slew of, yes, but maybe if this had been different, then it would be congruent with SDT, rather than just pointing out, honestly, SDT is not very specific about what exactly would be the thing here. So one, small thing that I've now tried to be just hyper mindful of is just include kind of this talk back paragraph. I don't know if Casper a few weeks ago talked about implications for theory. So I guess, that's kind of similar idea here. And I also just kind of, again, like coming from psychology, I used to have like a fairly narrow, specific way of thinking about what theory is for. And now I've kind of become interested in, okay, but what are the different things theory could be used? Maybe there are applications of, say, SDT that SDT itself hasn't been really planned for, but that would be interesting for HCI or for game development. And this is a bit out there, but at this year, for instance, we've been like taking the notion of theory translation like super literally, and we've been developing design theory from translating Chinese poetry, what it says about kind of thermal interaction, sensory interaction, just kind of pushing the boundaries. What do we mean by theory building, and what can theory be used for, and where does it come from?
Thank you for the great talk. I'm not sure if you've covered this already, but I'm going to ask you a slightly pragmatic and possibly grumpy question. Is this a little down to sort of the way we write papers, or we are writing papers and we are teaching people to write papers as well? I'm guilty of it as well. All these formulas where, you write, what is the gap? What is the motivation? Here's how I fit in. And sort of there seems to be no space for theory and empirical papers, rather than just touching upon it a little bit in discussion and saying, oh, this is similar to that, and this is not similar to that, and future work, and I can investigate it further. Good luck getting it published. So, I mean, do we need to think about a fundamental change in how inflexible we are in a way with the way we're teaching everybody to read and write these papers?
Yeah, definitely. I'm super happy you bring up these questions of writing conventions. So this is something I've been discussing. I've been like, it's still in the early stages. Like I'm working on a project with Casper Hornbeck about, especially like how do we formulate research questions in HCI, but also with one of my postdocs, Raquel Robinson. Like we've been looking at ChatGPT and how it relates to Chi writing conventions for better and for worse. So I definitely think like the conventions that have kind of become ingrained at Chi and other HCI publication venues don't foster this theoretical talk back. But again, to be fair, like at least specific to the case of SDT, it's not that we see much talk back in the psychological literature either. Like there are a few kind of pieces that are more critical or like about SDT, but you really have to dig for those. But I think, including small tweaks, implications for theory or theoretical talkback as part of your discussion section, 1 or 2 paragraphs, maybe that's a small way of kind of shifting the writing norms towards a direction where it just, well, not automatically, but it kind of helps normalize deeper theoretical engagement. Let's see.
Hi, thank you so much. So there seems to be quite a few people that you mentioned in the beginning interested in how theory should or could be used in HCI. So I got really interested to kind of look at the different approaches that have been taken here. I think last time your colleague Casper, I think that was here, he took a different approach of looking at Chi, all the papers, and kind of seeing, okay, let's see kind of theory, implication, and like present some sort of a thematic analysis on that. So here you're focusing on the use of one specific theory within one specific area, which is really interesting. So I'm thinking, given that that's your approach is so fruitful, are you thinking of maybe like creating some sort of best practice or some sort of a guidance for other researchers on what are the proper steps to follow to assess? Because we all have our own little theories and things that are kind of being used. So how can we learn from what you've done and do something similar?
So yeah, for the theorycraft project, that's definitely like one of the overarching goals is kind of to come up with some best practices, like what does it mean to translate theory from one field, like you find affect theory as articulated by Laurent Berlin, you think, ooh, that'd be interesting for my corner of HCI. How should you go about translating this? How do you know if the translation or the resulting translated theory is useful or good? Now I think where, at least right now, some of Casper's and my own thinking have been diverging is I think, and that's not necessarily like a big surprise here. I think it depends so much on both like what's the theory you're looking at, but especially also what do you want to use the theory for, and what's the domain. And that kind of everything else follows from that. And I think Casper right now, because he's been looking at least all of Chi 2021 and maybe Chi 2022 in his corpus. I know he's still writing up that paper. So yeah, I think he's been working kind of giving some general recommendations. How can all of HCI engage with all kinds of theory? And I mean, I've done that too now here, right, with the theoretical talkback, and these are fairly high level recommendations that do apply to all kinds of frameworks. But I think those carry us only this far, and I'm well, I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. But right now I'm a bit skeptical about how many general recommendations we can make that work for all kinds of theories, not just psychological theories, like say, yeah, feminist theory, affect theory, models, in ways that apply to all areas or many areas of HCI.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here.
Really great talk. So obviously we're going to continue this upstairs. Just to say we've got Frank visiting here from Melbourne, right? Yes. So he's going to come upstairs and join us as well. And we're going to go celebrate Elahi's achievements momentarily.
Nice.
Anything else? I think we're all good. Good. Well, good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And see you all upstairs. Second floor.